Welcome to Rad Flicks. My name is Joe. These are just opinions. I am Joepinionated. Today on Rad Flicks, comedy is for 1980. Some that didn't quite make it were movies like The Gods Must Be Crazy. Gods Must Be Crazy is kind of a classic around my home as a child too, and it's about this bushman coming into civilization, essentially. Pretty funny. Where the Buffalo Roam got a second place pick. That's Hunter S. Thompson with Bill Murray. 9 to 5, Jane Fonda, Lily Tomlin, and Dolly Parton was a runner-up, and it was also actually a top pick for one of our normal people on the board for the Rad Flicks. My top pick for this year was directed by Sidney Poitier. It's the comedy Stir Crazy with Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor. If you've ever watched Dumb and Dumber, they pull a lot from this movie Stir Crazy. And it's about these two guys that kind of get wrongfully accused, and absolutely hilarious. One of the funniest movies ever. And in my opinion, the funniest movie that both Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor made. And they made a series of comedies, and this is my favorite by far. Also a runner-up that did not make it to the final three is a Cheech and Chong's next movie. Third place for the Rad Flicks 1980 Raddest Comedy. Third place, voted on by normal people, not critics. These have stood the test of time, so forget all that crap in the old books. Directed by John Landis, we're going with Blues Brothers. Dan Aykroyd, John Belushi, a machine. He's a maniac. He's Chris Farley's idol. 1980, third place. We're going with, for comedy, we're going with Blues Brothers. Number 2, 1980, serious slapstick comedy, Canadian Leslie Nielsen. The movie is Airplane. Number 1, the funniest movie, the raddest comedy of 1980 goes to Caddyshack. Director Harold Ramis. Also starring Chevy Chase, Rodney Dangerfield, Bill Murray. Hilarious. This is one of the funniest movies ever made. The people have spoken. The normal people. This is not the critics. Fuck the critics. You talk to different people and they're totally attracted to different parts of this movie. For me, it's all about Rodney. When he's on the screen, he is the funniest thing ever. And I love Chevy and I love Bill Murray and I love it. The whole cast is great. But for me, it's Rodney. Looks good on you though. Next category, raddest comedies of 1981. So these are the funniest movies in 1981 according to our panel of normal Canadians. There's 6 of us. Some movies that didn't make it are Nice Dreams. It's probably my favorite Cheech and Chong movie. Also starring Paul Rubens, Pee Wee Herman. That's Paul Rubens. Starring Paul Rubens. Well, he doesn't even star in it. He's just in part of it. Also, The History of the World, Part 1. Got a shout out from Ian. I'm positive it would be him. Director Mel Brooks. Arthur got a shout out. I think they're actually remaking Arthur right now. Arthur's hilarious. 1980, Raddest Comedies, runner-up. Director Bob Clark. I think this is directorial debut. The movie is Porky's. It's pretty raunchy, a little risque. It's definitely not going to belong in a family movie night for sure. It's kind of a bunch of cheap laughs. Basically like the original American Pie, which is another one of these kind of movies with a bunch of, sex jokes and stuff like that. Wildly entertaining. The raddest comedy of 1981 belongs to director Ivan Reitman, and the movie is Stripes, starring Bill Murray, Harold Ramis, John Candy. Easily the raddest comedy of 1981 is Stripes. This thing stands the test of time. It's got absolute legends in it. It's got a legendary director in Ivan Reitman. This is before all these guys broke up. Next category for Rad Flicks 1982 is comedy. Comedies don't get any attention at the big award shows anyways. They often get glossed over by critics because they have no sense of humor. I do this one for my living room in high school here. Pretty cool. I had the whole Woodstock 99. A few of my buddies and I taped that whole thing. There's some of my old VHS collection, and if you can spot some, there's some winners from this year in that collection as well. Some of the runners up are as follows. Tootsie, starring Dustin Hoffman. Excellent movie, actually. Really good movie. Airplane 2, Basket Case is another runner-up. But really, 1982 came down to 2 strong comedies. In the second spot, starring Nick Nolte and Eddie Murphy, 48 Hours. A cop and a convict team up to catch the bad guy. It's a buddy cop movie. Clear cut number 1 for 1982's raddest comedy goes to Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Directed by Amy Heckerling, stars Jennifer Jason Leigh, Sean Penn. This is the early 80s coming of age comedy, somewhere between American Graffiti and Dazed and Confused. This movie is certified rad. I don't know what to say. This thing has definitely stood the test of time. This is a great movie. On to the next category. The next category is comedy. Comedy don't get any attention at the Academy Awards or any of the awards anyways, so we don't have to worry about that. Honorable mention for raddest comedy of 1983 goes to Strange Brew. Bob and Doug McKenzie. I actually wear the Dixon flannel for them in quite a few of the episodes too. I know our Christmas movie marathon. If you don't know the 12 Days of Christmas with Bob and Doug McKenzie, that's a cool one to check out too. Rick Moranis, SCTV. Another runner-up for this category, funniest movie in 1983, is A Christmas Story. So the finalists are as follows. So tie for third place for funniest movies of 1983, Eddie Murphy Delirious. In my opinion, the funniest stand-up comedy routine of all time is Eddie Murphy Delirious. I don't think I'm alone on that one. Eddie Murphy was the king of stand-up comedy and in the 80s. There's nothing else to say about that. He's the GOAT of the 80s. No question. Tied with Eddie for number 3 funniest movies for 1983 is the GOATs of comedy of all time, Monty Python, and their movie The Meaning of Life, which is their final movie before Graham Chapman sadly passed away. The end of Python. Love this movie. Definitely watched this one quite a few times. I could make 5 episodes on this movie alone. I love Monty Python. There'll definitely be more down the road. There's a panel here, so it's tied for third for funniest movies of 1983. I've got no option but to sell you all for scientific experiments. Number 2, and to me this is criminal, but hey, it's democracy. So we have voters on the panel, and maybe this is why people want me to do stuff with other people, so that my opinions don't matter anymore. But anyways, number 2, over top of Eddie Murphy Delirious and The Meaning of Life, we're going with Trading Places, starring Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy. I believe Dan Aykroyd wrote the movie. So this one was directed by John Landis as well. Incredible director. And yeah, hilarious movie. Super funny. Some of the stuff's dated. This movie stands the test of time as being an awesome, hilarious movie. Jamie Lee Curtis, whoa, whoa, wee, wah. Okay, I got a hard time arguing with number 1 for the funniest movie of 1983, Rad Flicks, certified raddest comedy of 1983, written by one of my very favorite screenwriters, John Hughes, starring Chevy Chase, Beverly D'Angelo. We're talking about National Lampoon's Vacation. Randy Quaid. It's the second best vacation movie in my opinion. This is the raddest comedy of 1983, National Lampoon's Vacation. John Candy also in there for a little bit, but yeah, Chevy Chase is so funny in the 80s. Especially John Hughes wrote this in National Lampoon's Vacation. I mentioned it in John Hughes episodes on this channel. Check that out. Also check out the Christmas movie marathon where I mentioned quite a few John Hughes movies. National Lampoon's Vacation. Remember to vote on the channel. Joepinionated. You can find me on YouTube. Next category for 1984, comedy. Honorable mentions. One of them, Romancing the Stone. That's Robert Zemeckis debut. Top Secret. This is Spinal Tap, Rob Reiner's mockumentary, maybe the funniest mockumentary of all time. Revenge of the Nerds. Love that movie. Very rated R. Should not be a family movie night. I've learned that one the hard way. My bad. Sorry. Apologies. Tom Hanks and Daryl Hannah's classic Splash is also from 1984. Runner up for funniest, raddest movie of 1984 is Police Academy. The first one, Mahoney, hilarious start to finish. Kim Cattrall, whoa, whoa, wee, wah, very pretty in this one. Steve Guttenberg. I just loved the Police Academy movies, especially when I was a kid. I'd always watch like the TV edited versions. I never realized how rated R they were till many years later. Directed by Hugh Wilson. 1984's Police Academy, runner up for raddest comedy. Tied for first, raddest comedy of 1984, we have Beverly Hills Cop with Eddie Murphy, Judge Reinhold. This one was directed by Martin Brest. Eddie Murphy just owns comedy in the 80s. I don't know if it's funnier than 48 Hours, but it's funnier than 48 Hours. Biggest star in the world at this point, I think, is Eddie Murphy. Tied for votes for funniest movie or raddest comedy of 1984. We have a movie that Eddie Murphy was supposed to originally be in, written by Dan Aykroyd. The movie is Ghostbusters. And here's a photo I took outside the actual fire hall. The exterior shots used, I think this is in Tribeca, Manhattan. Bill Murray stars in it, Sigourney Weaver, Rick Moranis. Directed by Ivan Reitman. So funny. Start to finish, hilarious movie. I don't know if it's my favorite Bill Murray, but it's definitely up there with my favorites. Rick Moranis is really underrated in this one. He's so good in everything he's in. This is actually from Bob and Doug McKenzie. This is a Dixon flannel. Love Rick Moranis. Dan Aykroyd, and one of the funniest SNL cast members of all time. Harold Ramis as well. Next up, Raddest comedy of 1985. The finalists are Brewster's Millions, directed by Walter Hill, starring Richard Pryor and John Candy. Brewster, he has to spend $30 million to make $300 million or something like that. So it's just a movie about him spending money and he can't tell anybody why. It's so much fun. Shout out to Walter Hill for being a person that can make one of those movies. And you make Richard Pryor and John Candy both look great. John Candy playing in one of his classic roles and Richard Pryor being his normal self. Next finalist for Raddest Comedy 1985 goes to The Breakfast Club. So that's John Hughes again. Next nominee for Raddest Comedy, directed by Richard Donner, 1985. We're going with The Goonies. That's on one of our Goonies, and we're big Goonies nuts. You'll see copper bones over my shoulder here when I turn off this background. But like I said, I've driven down to Astoria in the Oregon coast near Cannon Beach. I think it's called Ecola State Park. And that's where the restaurant scene was. If you're in the area and you love The Goonies, definitely check it out. It's really cool. Corey Feldman, Sean Austin, Data, Chunk, Sloth. Hey, you guys, Baby Ruth, Josh Brolin, Chester Copperpot, Booby Traps, The Pinches of Power, Slick Shoes, Yo, Mikey, gotta go to the bathroom. Why don't we just put chocolate all over the floor and let Chunk eat his way through? ORV, Bullet Holes. Up next, we get one of Woody Allen's classics, The Purple Rose of Cairo. This one's starring Mia Farrow. I have a Woody Allen list on this channel as well, so check out the channel below. Woody Allen movies, I think they're awesome. Next finalist for Raddest Comedy goes to this guy here, Paul Rubens, rest in peace. Huey's Big Adventure, written by Paul Rubens and Phil Hartman. Rest in peace to both of those guys, legends. The breakout movie as well for Tim Burton. He directed this. 1985 is so strong for some of my absolute favorite movies of all time. And this is another one of them. Pee Wee Herman's Big Adventure comes in the final as a finalist for greatest comedy or raddest comedy of 1985. This one features Twisted Sister. It features Wayne from the Wonder Years. There'll be some Wonder Years talk coming up in 1988 when that series kicks off. Be sure to tell them Large Marge sent ya. What? Up next, 1985, starring Chevy Chase, Beverly D'Angelo. We go back on vacation, this time to Europe, European Vacation from National Lampoons, in the mind of John Hughes. Chevy Chase in his prime. Is definitely owning in the mid 80s because he's also another finalist in the same category, Raddest Comedy of 1985. And this time it's Fletch. So once again, Chevy Chase, Fletch. I remember this one just dying laughing the first time I watched it. I really like Chevy's style of humor, kind of like asshole humor in a sense. Props to Chevy Chase. You're certified rad. 2 movies back to back for Raddest Comedy of one of the greatest years for movies, 1985, with Fletch and European Vacation. Another nominee for Raddest Comedy, 1985, is Clue. We already mentioned that one a little bit earlier. That one's so freaking good too, with Tim Curry. Another finalist is Police Academy 2. That's a Steve Guttenberg. Better Off Dead, starring John Cusack, 1985. Another finalist for Raddest Comedy of the Year. Directed by Savage Steve Holland. Even your younger brother does better than you do. Dark sort of comedy. Remember like 3 O'Clock High and these other sort of movies like that. This is one of those ones. It also has Booger from Revenge of the Nerds. And the winner for 1985's Raddest Comedy goes to Pee-wee's Big Adventure. Pee Wee Herman in Pee-wee's Big Adventure. Directed by Tim Burton, written by Paul Rubens, who's Pee Wee Herman, and Phil Hartman. Raddest Comedy of 1985, which is a huge year for these great movies. The runner-ups go to, in second place, the runner-up is Back to the Future for Raddest Comedy of 1985. And third place goes to The Goonies, my boys, The Goonies. Goonies Never Say Die, third Raddest Comedy of 1985. There's no basement in the Alamo. Up next, 1986, let's go with Raddest Comedy. Police Academy Part 3, Back in Training. This is the one I'm pretty sure where Bobcat Goldthwait debuted. Steve Guttenberg. Man, I loved the Police Academy movies when I was a kid. The guy that did all the voices, I can't remember his name. Bubba Smith. In this new one, new recruits face rigorous training. 3 and 4 I really liked a lot. Directed by John Landis, going with The Three Amigos, starring Martin Short, Chevy Chase, and Steve Martin. It's a movie about these three guys are actors, the Old West. They get sent on a mission that they think is another acting gig. Turns out to be real. Next finalist for Raddest Comedy of 1986 goes to John Hughes, starring Matthew Broderick and Alan Ruck in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Bueller. And old Ben Stein there doing the roll call.
Oh yeah. Boom, boom, boom.
Soundtrack's excellent. For me, the ultimate teen coming of age comedy. John Hughes in his prime, 1986. Next up, we have Crocodile Dundee. Paul Hogan and Crocodile Dundee. Lots of knife. Anytime a knife ever came out, ever, camping up until I was probably like 20 years old. Anytime somebody showed a knife, lots of knife. It's another thing I remember being at the video store, VCR at that point in the suitcase, those big VCR suitcase things, and bringing it home and setting it up the night or maybe possibly the weekend. Just remember seeing a wall of Crocodile Dundee VHS cassettes for rental. We've got Karate Kid 2 getting another shout out, this time in comedy. So I don't think that Mr. Miyagi thought things were that funny, Caro. Karate Kid 2 getting a shout out, breaking Mr. Miyagi's heart, Caro. Next up for comedy, Big Trouble Little China. That's John Carpenter starring Kurt Russell in a very incredibly rad movie. I mean, the logo of Rad Flicks could just be a photo of the cover of Big Trouble Little China. That movie's got rad all over it. It makes it the raddest comedy because it's definitely one of those ones that covers quite a few categories. Next up, another John Hughes, Pretty in Pink, starring Molly Ringwald. Hannah and Her Sisters. I'm glad that makes the list. So that's a Woody Allen hilarious movie. And last, directed by Alan Metter, the movie is Back to School, starring Rodney Dangerfield. Rodney Dangerfield, if you don't know, is one of the greatest stand-up comedians of all time. Is Rodney Dangerfield, and he did movies and lights out in all of them, even Ladybugs. I'll give him credit for Ladybugs. Watch him on Johnny Carson. I love Norm Macdonald's tributes to Rodney Dangerfield coming on talk shows and just basically playing it up like Rodney Dangerfield is so cool. It's kind of the Billy Madison thing, but 10 years earlier. Rodney Dangerfield, Back to School. And the winner of Raddest Comedy 1986 goes to Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Raddest Comedy of 1986. Director John Hughes. Raddest Comedy is Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Close second place, The Three Amigos, starring Chevy, Steve Martin, and Martin Short. Directed by John Landis. Third place runner-up goes to the Crocodile Dundee. The finalists for Raddest Comedy 1987 are 3 O'Clock High. 3 O'Clock High. I remember having nightmares about this movie. For some reason, I was so scared. And it's about a movie where this kid's got to face his bully at 3 o'clock. Raddest Comedy 1987 finalist. And the actor is Richard Tyson from Kindergarten Cop. Next, Raddest Comedy 1987 Lethal Weapon from Richard Donner, director of The Goonies. Mel Gibson, Danny Glover. Can't Buy Me Love, director Steve Rash, starring Patrick Dempsey, Amanda Peterson, and Courtney Gaines. It's about a nerdy kid that wants to pay this pretty girl to pretend to be his girlfriend for a few weeks. Next up, from Joel and Ethan Coen, Raising Arizona. Funniest movie of their first 10 years anyways, about these people that want to kidnap a baby because they can't have kids. Nicolas Cage and Holly Hunter. Up next, With Nail and I, which is sort of this hilarious comedy out of Scotland or England or Ireland or one of them. They'll all be mad for me saying that, but nobody watches this show anyway, so who gives a shit. Really funny comedy. One of the funniest things to come out of there in the 80s. With Nail and I. It's about a couple unemployed actors. Really funny. Directed by Menahem Golan. The movie is Over the Top, an arm wrestling movie starring Sylvester Stallone. Man, the guy does not miss a year of Rad Flicks. Over the Top was one of the most ridiculous movies ever, but definitely something I watched and loved as a kid. Up next, Mel Brooks again with Spaceballs. Definitely one of the funniest movies of the 80s and one of the funniest movies in Mel Brooks's large category of awesome Rad Flicks. Next up, The Princess Bride. Rob Reiner's The Princess Bride comes in as one of the finalists for funniest comedies of 1987. After that, we go back to Robin Williams in Good Morning Vietnam, which was directed by Barry Levinson and also starring Forrest Whitaker. Also in the finalists for Raddest Comedy 1987, Revenge of the Nerds Part 2. Up next for 1987, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles from John Hughes, starring John Candy and Steve Martin. Here's a good idea: when you're telling a story, have a point It makes it that much more interesting for the listener. John Candy, yeah, one of the greatest Canadian actors ever, period. There's so many movies where this guy wears his heart on his sleeve. Everybody loves John Candy. Chocolate and Cheese, a Ween record. I'm wearing a Ween shirt today. Chocolate and Cheese dedicated to John Candy. This is one of my favorite John Candy movies. This is my favorite John Candy movie, sorry. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Raddest comedy of 1987 goes to The Princess Bride. The runner-up for Raddest comedy 1987 goes to Spaceballs, directed by Mel Brooks. And third place goes to Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Next category, Raddest comedy. Nominees for Raddest comedy. First goes to, directed by Howard Deutsch. It's The Great Outdoors, written by John Hughes, but stars John Candy and Dan Aykroyd. Great Outdoors doesn't rank as high for me as quite a few of the John Candy and least favorites of this collaboration, but I do like Dan Aykroyd a lot. I like John Candy a lot. There's a few parts of this movie that are pretty funny. Next up, The Naked Gun from the Files of Police Squad, directed by David Zucker, starring Priscilla Presley and Canadian Leslie Nielsen. Bumbling idiot, Leslie Nielsen, O.J. Simpson. They take on this plot. He's a cop to investigate an assassination attempt on Queen Elizabeth II. Next up, Raddest comedy is Coming to America, directed again by John Landis. So John Landis just finishes in the tops on almost every year in Rad Flicks so far. Starring Eddie Murphy and Arsenio Hall. That's the one where he's king of, what is it, Zamunda or something like that? An African prince travels to New York, find his princess. Eddie Murphy, once again, king of the 80s. Eddie Murphy Delirious is probably my favorite stand-up of all time. Eddie Murphy Raw is top 5. Up next, Scrooged. Bill Murray, one of my very favorite Christmas movies, versions of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Up next, Twins, starring Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Play twins separated at birth. This hulk of a human being, and his brother is Danny DeVito, is this little guy. Up next, 1988, Alec Baldwin, Michael Keaton, Winona Ryder, Catherine O'Hara, Tim Burton. The movie is Beetlejuice. We love Beetlejuice around here. We love Tim Burton movies. Next finalist goes to A Fish Called Wanda, starring John Cleese, Kevin Kline, Michael Palin, Jamie Lee Curtis. I mean, this movie just has one of the greatest comedy casts ever, because you get two of the best Monty Python guys and John Cleese and Michael Palin. You get Jamie Lee Curtis, Kevin Kline, John Cleese co-wrote this movie. It's a banger. And the winner for Raddest comedy of 1988 goes to The Naked Gun from the Files of Police Squad, starring Leslie Nielsen. Tied for runner-up is Coming to America and The Great Outdoors. Tied for runner-up for Raddest comedies of 1988. Raddest comedy 1989. Nominees are, this is a very strong year for comedies. First off, directed by Jay Levy, starring Weird Al Yankovic, UHF. And I've done a series on Weird Al Yankovic on his channel. Love Weird Al Yankovic. Love UHF. Definitely going to be on my most watched list. UHF, Wheel of Fish. You're so stupid. Today, we're going to teach poodles how to fly. We don't need no stinking badgers. Love Weird Al Yankovic. Huge fan of this movie and everything Weird Al Yankovic has ever done. And he's an honorary Canadian. Anything Weird Al Yankovic touches is rad. Next up, Raddest comedy 1989. Finalist, The Burbs, directed by Joe Dante. This one stars Tom Hanks, Bruce Dern, Corey Feldman. It all takes place on one street, one little neighborhood in the suburbs. The Klopeks move to the block. Nobody trusts them. Classic plot. Next up, directed by David S. Ward. The movie is Major League from 1989. It's actually over my shoulder right here. That's my copy. I got a sealed copy still. Tom Berenger, Wild Thing, Sheen, Jobu. Just a legendary 80s comedy. Definitely one that got rented a lot by me or my friends, sleepovers as kids. Major League. Up next, directed by Stephen Herrick, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, starring Alex Winter and Keanu Reeves. This is where Bill S. Preston, Esquire, and Ted Theodore Logan travel through time after, what's his name? Legendary comedian. God, his name Ponytail. This movie taught me more about history than almost any movie I watched growing up as a kid. Beethoven, Genghis Khan, Joan of Arc, Napoleon, Socrates, Socrates, Beethoven, the Wild Stallions, taking Napoleon to the water park and for ice cream. What number am I thinking of? 69, dude. God Gave Rock and Roll to You. And what's his goddamn name? The comedian. And George Carlin to boot. Also come up in a lot of Kevin Smith movies down the road here. Legendary comedian George Carlin. Up next, for finalists for Raddest Comedy of 1989 goes to one of my granny's favorites, Weekend at Bernie's, When Harry Met Sally. This one's directed by Rob Reiner again, so he's back. Meg Ryan with Billy Crystal, about as big a romantic comedy as there's ever been, When Harry Met Sally. Also from 1989, directed by John Hughes, starring John Candy and little Macaulay Culkin as well. Uncle Buck, Pay a Rat to Chew That Thing Off Your Face. This time we get Tone Loc.
Wow thing. Wow thing.
You get Uncle Buck's car. You get the monster pancakes on Macaulay Culkin's birthday. Legendary John Hughes in his amazing run of directing. He was close with John Candy, and he went strong until John Candy tragically passed away. Took the wind out of John Hughes' sails when John Candy passed away. Up next, directed by Jeremiah Chechik, written by John Hughes. He originally wrote the story for Vacation in National Lampoon's magazine. That's where he got his start. Starring Chevy Chase, Beverly D'Angelo, and Christmas Vacation. Arguably, probably my most watched movie of all time would be Christmas Vacation. Clark W. Griswold Jr. breaking the land speed record on his sled. Raddest Comedy of 1989 goes to The Burbs. Raddest Comedy of 1989. Directed by Joe Dante. Second place tied Uncle Buck, tied with Christmas Vacation. So 2 shows written by John Hughes, 1 directed by John Hughes. Christmas Vacation was originally supposed to be directed by Chris Columbus. Chris Columbus butted heads with Chevy Chase. He's kind of famous for that. John Hughes said, "Don't worry about it. I got another Christmas movie for you. It's Home Alone. Hope it works out for you." It worked out pretty well for Chris Columbus and John Hughes. Third place for Raddest Comedy of 1989 goes to Weekend at Bernie's. So there you have it. The 1980s wrapped up. That's 1989. We've gone all the way from 1980 to 1989 in a short period of time. I want to thank our panel of normal Canadians, all 6 of yous. Sure to like, comment, subscribe. Put your opinions in the description below. I'd love to talk to you there's a Discord created for Joepinionated. Look it up. Patreon as well. Check me out on all socials. I'm always posting every record that we're listening to around the house. The 90s coming up next. Also some deep dives into some musicians such as the Tragically Hip and Ween. I know you might have noticed the Ween Quebec on my shirt here. I'm a big time fan of Ween. Going to do a deep dive for those guys soon as well. I'm sorry, I'm a little low on facts and high on opinions.